guess.
Thanks. I hope so. So thanks very much for inviting me. It's really nice that I can see everyone, actually, because quite often you just feel like you're talking to yourself on these things. So thanks very much for tuning in this evening. I'm going to talk about toxic trade deals. If I'm going too fast or you miss something or something doesn't make sense, by all means, put it in the chat. Obviously, there's going to be questions at the end, and I will try, if I can keep my attention focused on all these different bits, then I'll try and address it and answer questions as I go along, if that's possible. So first of all, yeah, my organization, Global Justice Now, has been around 50 years this year. It's our 50th birthday, and we've always talked about trade. We've talked about a lot of other aspects of the global economy, but trade is absolutely central to the global economy and how the global economy works. And very often what you find is the rules of the trade system are effectively the rules of the global economy, which is why this is such an important topic. And although trade can seem a bit dry sometimes, when you kind of step back and look at the big picture of what trade rules do, you find an awful lot of answers to the kind of inequities that we find around the world today, and why some countries are so rich and some countries are so poor. So trade is about power and has always been about power. You have a lot of people in our government at the moment who hark back to this kind of heyday of British free trade in the middle of the 19th century, and they seem to think they are kind of running an empire. And for a lot of them, that's what Brexit was all about. And right at the heart of that, really central to that, is trade. And I think that's why they've rushed into this. It's a crazy time to be rushing into talks on a completely new massive trade deal with the US, but they've done it because it's so fundamental to what they think Brexit's all about and how they want to reshape this country. And when you hear free traders talk about, you know, the wonders of free trade, you would imagine that it's almost impossible to lose out from trade rules or trade deals. You would imagine it has a wonderful, glorious history that's all about kind of lifting all boats, making people everywhere better off and improving their lives. You only have to have a cursory glance at the history of the British Empire in the middle of the 19th century to realize that's never been the case. That the kind of trade we imposed on other countries, well, for example, just look at China, where we went in with gunships and essentially bombarded their ports until they allowed us to export opium into their markets, creating a massive social crisis in that country. The Chinese know a lot about it. In Britain, it's completely forgotten. Or the trade we did with India, where there were, indeed Ireland, where there were famines raging at the same time as food was being exported out of those countries, because, you know, what you have to do, what you must do, is always listen to the market and follow the rules of the market and do what the market demands, and everything will be fine. And it caused absolute devastation in many countries around the world during the period that some of our politicians like harking back to. None of that is to say trade is necessarily a bad thing. Trade can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. It depends how it's done. It depends on the kind of rules that guide it. But we should never believe that there are no losers from trade. There are always going to be losers from trade deals and trade rules. It might still be worth trading, but you've got to put stuff in place to make sure that those who lose out are given alternative employment, and that there's investment, and that there are welfare states in place. All the things that have been kind of ripped apart in our societies precisely as the free trade mantra has taken hold over the last 4 decades of the neoliberal economy. And really what we've ended up with is a kind of global trade system created late 80s, early 90s, which has been very, very good and very beneficial for corporations, very good for international capital, very good for the 1%, but at the expense of the environment, at the expense of our ability to create a more equal society, and even at the expense of our democratic rights as citizens. And one of the reasons for that is trade is incredibly enforceable. So the rules are, unlike all the rules that we try to push for and create at an international level, human rights law and environmental law and so on, these tend to be very weak. Trade rules are extremely enforceable, especially since the foundation of the World Trade Organization. And so if you want a rule that's enforceable at international level, your best bet is to try to claim it's got something to do with trade and get it pushed into either the WTO or get it pushed into a trade deal. And that's what's happened really over the last kind of 3 or 4 decades. And so now you have trade deals that are absolutely enormous, extremely broad, have massive impacts across all of our society. So, you know, if you looked at trade 50 years ago, you were more or less talking about tariffs, you know, the taxes that you apply to goods when they come into a country. And that can be important, but today tariffs are very small, actually very small parts of modern trade deals. And particularly if you look at trade deals between developed countries, like the proposed trade deal between Britain and the United States, tariffs are going to play really quite a small role in that, because we already have extremely low tariffs. You know, it's not like we don't trade with the United States. We do trade with the United States. We have very low tariffs on most of that trade. And that's, you know, it's for the most part not an issue, or it's where we are anyway. But what a trade deal with the United States would be about is essentially what are called non-tariff barriers to trade. What is a non-tariff barrier to trade? Well, essentially it's a regulation. It's a standard. It's how we regulate our public services. It's how we regulate medicine prices. It's how we regulate our food standards. All of these things have become trade issues because of lobbying by big business over recent years. And what I'm going to do is spend 10 minutes or so kind of explaining how that works. Because I think for a lot of people, the idea that a trade deal is going to affect the NHS or a trade deal is going to affect our food standards is a bit strange, because why would it? So I want to kind of explain that a little bit. So let's take probably the most iconic issue in a UK-US trade deal to date, which is chlorine chicken, which I knew nothing about before I started working on a potential trade deal with the, well, before I started working on TTIP. I don't know if people know, probably most of you know what TTIP was, a very big proposed trade deal between the US and the EU, which through campaigning over a number of years, we managed to stop completely several years ago, which was a huge victory for trade campaigners and proof that we can do this kind of stuff. And chlorine chicken was a really big issue in this. And it's really become a kind of shorthand for regulatory, what's called regulatory harmonization. How does it work? Well, imagine so people probably know in the United States, an awful lot of food is produced in factories, essentially. It's industrial level, industrial scale food production, where, you know, thousands and thousands of cows or chickens or pigs or whatever are kept in extremely confined spaces. They are fed with antibiotics and steroids and hormones to produce growth, because the conditions they're living in are so horrible that the animal would just die without these things and certainly wouldn't grow. So you do that as fast as possible. You pump them with as many chemicals as possible, and you get the most meat that you can possibly attain in that animal's short life. With poultry, particularly at the end of that life, so it's often washed in a chlorine dip. It doesn't always have chlorine in, but it's some kind of antibacterial dip. The problem with this is not the chlorine itself, really. I mean, we go to swimming pools and probably take in some chlorine. So chlorine is not necessarily the worst thing about it. The worst thing about it is the fact that it's used precisely because the animal lives in such appalling conditions while it's alive. And so it accumulates all sorts of bacteria. And rather than treating rather than processing the meat in a way that you can get rid of that bacteria in a kind of pleasant way, you just dunk it in kind of bleach at the end of its life, and it's supposed to kill everything. It doesn't actually even kill everything, but the point is that it's a short way that you can get rid of pathogens on animals, and it makes up for a really unpleasant life that animals have to live. But people don't like the idea of chlorine chicken, and because of that, it's become a kind of symbol for lowering food standards. It works because if I'm a chlorine chicken farmer from the United States, I look at the European market, I look at the British market, and I say, I'm not allowed to export my goods into your markets because of your standards on animal welfare. For me, that's not primarily a democratic decision about how you want to regulate your food market. For me, that looks like a trade barrier. And because it looks like a trade barrier, I have a right to lobby for this in a trade deal to be removed, right? So industrial agriculture in America obviously has a huge amount of lobbying power. And it uses that lobbying power on the US administration to say, when you get into negotiations with these guys, we want these standards removed, right? We want to be able to import our goods into the British market, and we don't want any of those kind of protectionist barriers. Of course, to us, these are not primarily protectionist barriers. They're primarily just standards that we've lobbied for over many years that have improved animal welfare in Britain. It's still far from perfect, but it's certainly better than it is in the United States. But that discussion kind of takes place across all industrial sectors, all products that we consume that can be imported into another country. And it's the main problem really with modern trade deals. They kind of see everything as if the only thing we are concerned about is the gigantic marketplace we live in, and how you need to reduce all barriers to exporting and importing goods into different markets. So, you know, chlorine chickens are one example. There's also all sorts of examples from the meat industry, which I could go into if people are interested, but I won't. But it's not just the meat industry at all. It applies to, like, take cosmetics, right? Something I don't really think about very much, but cosmetics in the United States are made to a radically different standard to cosmetics in Britain. So in the United States, about 11 or 12 chemicals are banned in cosmetic production, 12. In Britain, it's about 1,200. Right? So they are made to radically different standards. In America, hair products regularly have formaldehyde in them, which is completely banned in Britain. So the stuff that Trump puts on his hair is probably full of formaldehyde, which may explain a few things about why he behaves the way he does. There are other horrible things like, I mean, this is almost unbelievable to me, but like there are traces of asbestos that have been found in makeup marketed at children in America. And the regulatory authority is so weak in that country because it's been given no new power since the 1930s that it can't even stop this happening. It can just put out a kind of thing saying, we don't think this is very good, probably don't buy it. But it can't actually stop the marketing of stuff with asbestos in. So they are radically different standards, and Trump is deregulating this stuff by the week. And so these are the main things we should be worried about in a US trade deal. The massive downward pressure on deregulation. These things don't change standards for our producers. Our producers still have to make stuff to our standards. But of course, if you're a farmer and you suddenly have to compete with animal products made to much, much lower standards, what are you going to do? I mean, you can try and carve out a niche market for yourself, so that, you know, particular middle class consumers will buy your product because it's made to better standards. But ultimately, you've got to lobby the government to reduce our standards too, or you go bankrupt. You know, you can't compete with it. Same with makeup, same across the board. So they put this kind of downward regulatory pressure on products all across the board. And food just tends to be the thing that people are most concerned about for obvious reasons. So that's one big thing. Second big thing that I know you wanted me to talk about a bit tonight is public services. So we talk about the NHS being under threat in a trade deal. What do we mean by that? We don't mean that one American healthcare multinational is going to come in and buy up the whole of the NHS, right? That is not going to happen under a trade deal. However, that does not mean the NHS isn't under threat, because what trade deals do these days is they tend to lock in liberalization and privatization. And they do that so that overseas markets that you're trading with, overseas capital, overseas business can contract in the same way that British companies can for the contracted out bits of public services. And if you withdraw the contracts, if you withdraw the marketization of those bits of services, then foreign businesses will say, well, that wasn't fair. When we did the trade deal, we expected to be able to compete for your services, and now we can't anymore. So it locks in privatization. And we all know, I think, that the NHS, I'm sure Ellen talked about this last week, is already being privatized in so many different ways. You know, we've got Virgin running bits of the NHS, we've got Serco running bits of the NHS, and this would extend the rights to bid for those bits of the NHS to American multinational corporations, and it would make it extremely difficult to rescind that marketization. In fact, there are even things in, there are two clauses I particularly like in modern trade deals. One's called a standstill clause and one's called a ratchet clause. And standstill clauses say basically you can't go backwards in terms of liberalization, and ratchet clauses say all you can do is ratchet up the level of liberalization. You can only liberalize more. You can't undo it, right? And these things are almost certain to be in a US trade deal. It is possible to exempt certain sectors, but it is becoming more and more difficult to do that. And you've already seen that Donald Trump said, you know, well, of course the NHS is on the table, everything's on the table. That's the wonders of a modern trade deal. So this is a real threat to the NHS. As I say, not that it's just going to be sold off as a building, but that the levels of liberalisation will be locked in and almost impossible for a future government to rescind. There is also a very specific worry when it comes to the NHS, which is about medicine prices. So as well as trade, we work quite a bit on pharmaceuticals and trying to ensure pharmaceuticals are researched and produced without patents, because patents became a trade issue in the mid-90s. Through something called the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related intellectual property agreement in the WTO. And what that does is enforce a certain basic standard of patent, of intellectual property rights that the company that produced something, that researched something and that holds the patent can enjoy anywhere they trade around the world. And this caused an absolute disaster when it was first introduced in the mid-90s, because that was exactly the time that medications were starting to be developed for HIV and AIDS. And it meant that African countries, particularly where the crisis was the worst, that wanted to buy and distribute those medicines, couldn't do so because they couldn't afford the medicines. And under trade law, they were unable to produce those medicines themselves because they were told, no, the patent is owned by XX multinational corporation over here. Now, in this country, we have certain regulations that allow the NHS to negotiate the price they pay for medicines. Medicines prices are still too high. Just the increase in the price the NHS pays for medicines over the last 5 years, just the increase in price is more than the entire NHS debt. So it is causing a real strain on the NHS already, but it is as of nothing compared to the price that Americans pay for drugs. I mean, essentially in the United States, there is no ability for Medicare or Medicaid to negotiate drug prices. Drug companies can basically charge whatever the market will bear. And so you find cases of medicines, especially new medicines, that can be produced for, you know, a few dollars being sold for thousands of dollars. And it's a particular worry at the moment with COVID vaccines and so on. And we're trying to call for those to be made patent free, but there is no restriction on that at the moment at an international level. So that's really worrying. And the American administration has said time and time and time again, it does not like the fact that the NHS can negotiate prices, and it wants to remove it under a trade deal because it thinks it's unfair. If they were to remove that, if prices were to increase of patented drugs to the NHS, I believe it would cause an existential threat to the NHS. It would simply, well, it would mean that drugs were unaffordable, and it would either bankrupt the NHS, or the NHS would have to say more and more and more drugs coming onto the market, especially innovative and new drugs, we just can't afford. And the only way you can afford them is to go privately. And clearly that would have a very, very detrimental impact on the NHS. So the NHS, I believe, is under threat for two reasons. One, the liberalisation of services. One, intellectual property. There's a number of other things. I'll just rattle through them really quickly. Obviously, we're all concerned about the environment and climate change. We know from leaked papers from these trade talks that the British government is not even allowed to mention the words climate change in the negotiations. That's a requirement of the US administration, who say it's just a no-go area. It gets worse. There's all sorts of things about trade deals that are really atrocious for climate change. One of the worst, and we don't know if this will be in a US deal, but is the attempt to create a kind of free market in fuels. And one of the things that has come up in trade agreements before is the concept of energy neutrality. Essentially, you're not allowed to discriminate between renewables and fossil fuels, or between any two different types of energy. So clearly a disaster for any attempt to deal with climate change. And there are many other things in terms of deregulation that obviously are going to be have a terrible impact on our ability to deal with climate change. There's a load of stuff about our rights online. Big tech companies, the Facebooks and Googles and whatnot, are lobbying very, very heavily now for e-commerce chapters in trade deals that would essentially give them similar rights to the rights that Big Pharma have. So the right to do what they want with your data, basically, to take it across borders, to store it in another country, not to even have a local presence in the country that they're making money from. So how the hell do you tax them and regulate them? Quite scary stuff there. That would cement the power of big tech in the global economy for the foreseeable future. So huge. And then, you know, just a basic problem about democracy. I mean, trade deals are negotiated behind closed doors. They're negotiated in secret. We've just had sight of letters signed by the UK government and the US administration saying all of the papers related to the trade talks that are now ongoing between the UK and the US will be kept confidential and secret for 5 years after the trade deal is completed and entered into effect. Right? So even a future government would not be able to release those papers. We wouldn't be able to see them for 5 years after the trade deals come into effect. Extraordinary. Our MPs are not allowed to see those papers. Our MPs are not allowed to vote on the government's objectives. Our MPs are not allowed and have no ability to stop the trade deal once it's been negotiated. We have a startling lack of accountability. I mean, for all those people who spent years talking about parliamentary sovereignty, our parliament has no ability to control trade policy, in spite of the very valiant efforts of Caroline Lucas to try to give Parliament those rights. Not a single Tory voted for her amendment when it came up in January. So it's absolutely shocking. And the interesting thing is, when we start negotiating, well, we have started negotiating, if we ever get a deal with the EU, MEPs will have so much more power over that deal than our MPs will have, because thanks to the TTIP campaign in particular, and thanks to the Green Group in particular, and the Social Democrats and the Left Group in the European Parliament, we pushed accountability and transparency on trade policy in the EU. It may even be, depending on what's in that trade deal, that our friends in the Wallonian Assembly in Belgium will have more power over an EU-UK trade deal than our MPs will. So frightening levels of scrutiny and lack of accountability. It's unbelievable, but they launched the trade talks last week. I mean, the trade talks have already been going on for quite a while. You'll remember in the beginning of the election, Jeremy Corbyn held up some redacted papers at one of the debates. They were papers that we'd managed to get released from the unofficial trade talks that have been going on since Brexit, really. We got them, we asked for them under freedom of information. The government said they weren't going to give us anything. We appealed, and the government said, oh, okay, maybe we'll give you something. And they gave us hundreds of papers, almost entirely blacked out. So like basically they had page numbers on, and that was about it. So we then launched a court case, and Corbyn found out about this and held up the papers. But basically that's still all we've got in terms of, oh no, well, they were leaked, of course, but other than that, we've got nothing in terms of the official trade talks that have now started. All the trade discussions that are happening between our government and more than a dozen other countries. Right? We have no details of those talks at all, including Israel, including Turkey, including India. Right? We have no idea what's happening in those trade talks either. So despite all of this, I'm just going to finish off with some hope, because it's really scary stuff, all of this. But I want to say, despite all of that, despite the fact our MPs have no power, despite the fact we don't know we can't know for sure what our government's giving away in our name, I am quite hopeful about this. And I suppose that's partly because of the TTIP campaign. So for those of us who were involved in that, it was just so amazing to go from the beginning of the TTIP campaign to like where nobody knew anything about TTIP. And we'd go and talk to politicians, and we'd go and talk to the media, and they would say, no, you're making this up. It can't possibly be right. And gradually convincing them that it was right, and getting some champions there who were prepared to fight on it, and doing the days of action, doing the street protests. I mean, just swamping MPs. with actions and getting to the point where we derailed it. I mean, we just controlled the narrative, and it was really grassroots. You know, it was not, we had very, very, very few friends. Caroline always was, but we had very few friends, even in Parliament, on this. And getting to the point where we controlled the narrative on that was amazing. And where people across Europe were having, you know, demonstrations of, you know, 500,000 people and so on. We're not in the European Union, so that makes it harder. We're a smaller country, but I still think that there are enough constituencies that are worried about some of this stuff that we really can derail it. And they're not just, you know, our friends and our allies on our side of the debate who are concerned about the NHS. I was astonished when the Agriculture Secretary made his first outing in January, and he went to speak to some farmers, some NFU farmers, so not known for their radicalism. And he was booed as soon as he mentioned a US trade deal. That's extraordinary. So farmers are worried about this, and farmers, I just think, have got to be great allies in this, because so many of them are based in the Tory heartlands. And as soon as they start getting upset and making their voices heard, people are going to know about it. The NFU's already had a little demonstration in Whitehall about a US trade deal. So that's pretty exciting, I think. And I think that post-COVID, you know, people are, I mean, this country obviously always has loved the NHS, and we see it as like the kind of pinnacle of what a civilized society should be able to create. And I think post-COVID, that's going to increase. And it's going to be very, very difficult, really, for the government to explain how the NHS isn't threatened by this stuff when we're going to be continually getting stuff out of the US side saying that it is. So I think there are some possibilities to make a really powerful coalition on this. And I sense, I mean, despite the big parliamentary majority that Johnson's got, I just think it's one of those issues where actually we might be able to do some real damage to that majority and derail this. And of course, you know, there are tensions built into those trade talks as well. It's not just what's coming from us. I mean, just like the TTIP talks, there are inherent tensions with these talks. That there are things that we will be asked to give up, which will be extremely difficult, even for business, even for big business in this country. So there will be natural tensions that we'll be able to play on and expose and so on. So really, really important, I think, for everyone to just get involved and start making a fuss and start talking to people about this and taking up. I posted something about all of our actions and resources on trade and so on. But please get involved in any way you can, because I think this could provide Johnson with a bloody nose. And it's really important in itself. I mean, clearly we want to stop this happening, but it's important not just for its own sake, not just to stop this trade deal in and of itself, but because for me, I think this is the absolute heart of what the leaders of the Brexit campaign in the Tory party believe Brexit is about. Right? So why are they so insistent on doing this? Because they've always seen the break with the EU as the possibility to draw our economy closer to the United States, because they see the United States as a perfect example of a deregulated, liberalized economy. And that's what they've got in store for us. And they want to try and sneak it through in a US trade deal. Even if they don't get it, they're going to try and do it. But it would be such a step back for them if they lost this one. It would be such a devastating blow to their project. And I hope that by defeating it, we can also start encouraging people in this country to start thinking about trade as a really important issue that, as political people, as activists, we should be concerned about, because you know, the trade system internationally is falling apart. And it's falling apart for good reason. It's falling apart because it's fostered and fueled massive climate breakdown. It's fostered and fueled massive inequality. And, you know, Trump's nationalist trade agenda looks quite appealing to people who felt that, like working people who felt that. And of course, we know that Trump's nationalist agenda, Trump's kind of America First agenda, is a complete disaster for internationalism and so on. So but we can't just cling to those old kind of, you know, the WTO and these things that he's actually trying to erode the power of. We need to come up with something fundamentally new. That's the only way to undermine this kind of new populist right wave. So we've been working on that as well, kind of what an alternative trade system could look like. And for those of you who are kind of interested in debates around that, I can talk more about that in questions if you like, but I think I've been going on long enough.
Thank you so much, Nick. Again, Zoom applause is strange, but thank you so much. That was incredible. And look, there's rounds of applause for brilliant. Yeah, I saw everyone scribbling away and making notes, and I was this time typing because, usually it's such a mess at the end. But you know, that was terrific, and thank you so much for sharing such a so much detail in such a nice and concise way. So it was really appreciated. Right, now we have over to the floor some questions. People have been sending them in through me during this, so I've got some already, but if you do have any, send them to me privately in the chat on your right hand side. But yeah, let's kick off with one maybe just following on from what you were saying, Nick, around how trade has become a project of Brexit, a project of the right, and the question is, how do we ensure that narratives around trade justice that emphasise bringing trade rules under popular control don't slide into or reinforce nationalistic narratives about comparative advantage vis-a-vis other countries? And for example, like different approaches to NAFTA in the US, where trade injustice has been manipulated by Trump, etc., into a right-wing talking point, whereas in the 90s it was a left-wing anti-globalization issue, more or less.
Yeah, do you want me to take them one by one?
Yeah, let's go for that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I mean, Trump got a lot of support by taking, in some ways, a left-wing line on trade, in some ways, a very right-wing line on trade. I mean, he got America out of TPP, which was a big call of activists. I mean, it wasn't just him, you know, Bernie Sanders was pushing it very hard as well. But yeah, he has presented us with some issues because, of course, some of what he's done, you know, we would want to happen. In fact, there's a very interesting thing in the renegotiated NAFTA where, and I don't think it's ever been done in a trade deal before, and it kind of says, look, you can trade this stuff with us, providing this stuff is made in factories that pay a certain minimum wage. That's really interesting. I mean, because you can imagine applying that to the environment as well. So we'll trade with you, but we'll trade with you when you apply, you know, decent standards, and in that way you could kind of race to the top. And of course, that's not what Trump wants. But you know, now he's put it in there. It's quite, and in fact, he set it at a rate where it's not really going to make any difference. But now he's put it in there. He's kind of proved you can do it. So that's kind of interesting. But overcoming the nationalist question on this is very, very difficult because, you know, in America, one of the big, what people talk about a lot is offshoring. So offshoring jobs to other countries. And there's a reality to that. I mean, America has lost a lot of manufacturing jobs to China and other places. And, you know, in places where those jobs had existed before, people are understandably bitter about it. But at the same time, it fuels a kind of anti-Chinese sentiment, which is absolutely huge in America today. I mean, even on the left in America, anti-Chinese sentiment is quite scary, I think. So how do you kind of reconcile those two things? One way to do it, I think, is to say, look, it's not like nothing changes in the economy. It's not like, you know, in Lancashire, you still have to be producing, you still have to have cotton mills. I mean, it's fine for other countries to produce cotton and manufacture cotton as well. There's no problem with that. But the people who are manufacturing cotton need a job. They need a livelihood. They need to have a dignified life. You can't, and of course, the way trade's being used under neoliberalism is just to say, well, if you lose out, it's your own fault, really, and you've got to pull your socks up and you've got to get on with it and you've got to find something else. And that's ridiculous. I mean, because trade is always creates losers, and the job of a government is to say, okay, maybe it is better to have cotton made here, cotton produced over here, but the people of that region need investment. The people of that region, short-term problem, will need welfare, will need support, will need training, will need investment, so that they can develop an alternative kind of economy. And that's the thing that's been missing. Like we've kind of conflated the idea of open markets with the free market. And I think there's some really interesting stuff here said by Danny Roderick, who's a Turkish economist. He does a lot of really good stuff on trade. And he says, look, after the Second World War, we had this idea that, yeah, broadly open markets were a good thing, but they were a good thing as long as you had lots of exemptions, as long as you let countries pursue their own path to development, as long as you let them pass environmental laws, and they were always seen as more important than you know, free trade for its own sake. And very importantly, as long as you let them create decent welfare states and mechanisms to redistribute the benefits of that trade. Because if you don't have that, then free trade is simply, the benefits are simply going to accrue to those at the top. You know, because we have no power or leverage to ensure those benefits are shared more widely throughout society. And that's what's happened. And if you look at actually countries which have done, you know, which you'd say have probably done fairly well from free trade, Scandinavian countries, you know, they're very free trade countries, but they are countries that have very strong regulation, very strong welfare states to redistribute the benefits of that trade around their population. Now, there are still problems with that at a global level. But I think by and large, it's an interesting way to look at it, to say, yeah, open markets, I don't have a problem with open markets, but you've got to give governments within the international economy the ability to regulate capital and the ability to regulate those who are benefiting from trade, because that's the only way the rest of us are going to benefit. It's the only way you're going to, that trade is not simply going to trample all over our rights, trample all over the environment.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Nick. I had a couple of questions that were just on maybe like a very similar like topic on, like you've spoken about alternative trade systems, and maybe you could expand on perhaps if you were to reinvent the trade system, what would it look like? What are the basic principles that it would like be founded upon?
Definitely. And I've got actually something on our website called 10 Alternatives to a Corporate Dominated Trade System. So it's a nice little briefing. I can't find it right now, but yeah, do have a look for that if you're interested in it. But I think for me, the big difference that we've got to kind of make this kind of mental change between, yeah, we want international trade rules. We want to make sure trade is done in a fair way. Of course, I'm not against that at all. But the rules we currently have are not that. They're the very opposite. And that's because the rules we currently have are all about embedding and fueling liberalization. I mean, they are trade liberalization deals. They are trade liberalization rules. That's what we have at the moment. And I don't think that's what we want. I think what we want is rules that regulate trade so that it works for the common good. And if it doesn't work for the common good, then don't do it. But insofar as it does, fine, do it. Insofar as it helps build employment and all the rest of it, then trade. But that means you have to have quite a sophisticated structure of rules and regulations that allow governments to intervene in the trade system to control it, to control the way capital behaves. I mean, one of the most frightening things, which I didn't even get onto in my talk about modern trade deals, isn't just about the trade in goods and services. It's actually the investment chapters, the investment agreements, because what these are is essentially charters for international capital that allow international capital to go where it wants, when it wants, and behave how it wants. And the most crazy thing, you've probably all heard about this, within investment chapters is these ISDS, these corporate court systems. They're called ISDS, they don't call themselves corporate courts, but we call them corporate courts. They're actually investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. But they allow international investors to sue a government for essentially changing anything, all right, changing any regulation that impacts on or infringes on their profits. But actually, the whole point of regulation is to infringe on profits, is to control how corporations and capital behave, or good regulations, I believe, should be. So it's kind of, and you've probably all heard about examples of, Philip Morris that makes Marlboro cigarettes suing Australia for putting cigarettes in plain packaging, and corporations suing Canada, it's Quebec actually, state of Quebec, for trying to put a moratorium on fracking, and on and on and on. We're going to be faced with all of these cases if we have a trade deal with the US, and our companies are already involved in these cases with developing world countries. And this is absolutely crazy, because the whole point of a trade deal should be how you can harness and control that capital. So you say, yeah, okay, if you want to come and invest here and set up some employment, that could be really useful. We don't mind that, but you've got to be able to pay your taxes. You've got to abide by certain standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what trade rules and investment rules should be about, ensuring that happens. Not saying you're absolutely not allowed to do any of this, which is what they currently do and are doing more and more and more and more. And yeah, one of the big things to look out for in the US deal will definitely be the investor chapter, because I think there will be an ISDS in it. I didn't think there would be for a while because Trump doesn't particularly like them, but actually it looks like they are pushing for it. And that will open up a future British government to being sued by any multinational corporation or investor that wants to, for practically any regulation that we will probably be pushing for.
Thanks so much, Nick. Yeah, the pro-corporate agenda, isn't it? Just amazing how deep its roots go. It's terrifying. And I was just going to move us on to like a similar question around the fact that these things are terrifying. And the more I was reading, the more even just me writing the blurb for this event, I was freaking out. finding out more and more. But these issues, like trade justice and trade issues, can seem like fairly distant to people at the best of times. And then this person, I think it's from Matthew, has put in brackets, although the spectre of chlorinated chicken seems to have broken through with a few people. But do you think it's getting easier or harder to drive trade justice to the top of the general political agenda in the current circumstances? And similarly, like Johan asks, what is the political route to democratic control over trade negotiations?
I think it's getting easier. I mean, so I first became an activist in the anti-globalization movement. So that was a great time if you wanted to complain about trade, and we like followed the WTO all around the world and whatever, and actually stalled it. I mean, the successes in trade campaigning have been phenomenal, actually. Although we are in, it's not like we've won everything, clearly, otherwise we wouldn't be in this mess. But we have definitely stopped it being much worse than it was going to be. When we halted the WTO from making any decisions for more than 10 years, we not only stopped TTIP, but we've stopped any deal so far that's got TTIP style investment protection in. We stopped a deal before TTIP called the MAI in the late 90s. So we've had some great successes, but there was a dip. There was definitely a dip after the anti-globalization wave. And when we were all out fighting the Iraq war and so on, you know, people got less interested in the global economy, and they also, their side got better at doing these deals in a different way that made them harder to fight. I think TTIP has changed it all. TTIP and TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, by the way, our trade secretary is desperate for us to sign. I mean, they don't seem to have noticed that we're not a Pacific country, but Brexit can achieve all manner of miracles, clearly, including allowing us to become a Pacific country and sign the TPP. So that's another one we'll need to watch out for. But I think the age of these giant, you know, these mega trade deals, the TTIP, the TPP, there was something called TISA, which is kind of in abeyance now too, and CETA, which is the one that's nearly there, unfortunately, the Canada-EU deal. These mega deals that were so big actually allowed us in civil society to produce coalitions, once again, that were big enough to defeat these deals. And of course, what you do is you don't talk about a trade deal per se, except to people who are really interested like you. But you talk about the NHS, you talk about chlorine chicken, and that, it gives it a real resonance. People get it. People start saying, oh, okay, it's going to make a real difference to my life. This is aside from all the growth figures that get talked about by the government. And in that way, you start controlling the narrative, because it's actually quite hard for the government to then argue. I mean, they're still going to argue, but don't you want cheaper stuff? And that still has resonance. That does still work to some degree. But I think, yeah, there are some of the horrors of the American meat industry, and certainly some of the horrors of what could happen to the health system have been very, very powerful. And our farmers as well, right? So talking about farmers' livelihoods and so on, it's a way to get into different constituencies and different communities. And I think that's been really successful. I think we will get to the stage where they will wake up to that, and they will start being more clever about it. And I think actually the American administration is already starting to do that. So it's already starting to say, we're going to stop doing these big mega deals. We're going to start doing a series of much smaller deals. And I thought they'd do that with the UK, actually. I thought they would say, well, okay, there's 10 different deals here, which makes it much harder for us to assemble a coalition on, much harder to defeat. And it also means even less scrutiny and accountability and so on. But they haven't done it yet. So let's keep going as long as they don't, and pulling those coalitions together. And yeah, the question about democratic trade is a great one. Look, one of the things we're arguing at the moment is, okay, if you're just talking about tariffs, you know, maybe there's some argument for you need to do some of that. You can't do every bit of that in a thoroughly democratic way, because there's always going to be people objecting very strongly to removing tariffs and protection on certain sections of society, and so you'd never do anything. Okay, maybe that's an argument, maybe it's not. But when it comes to things like food standards, when it comes to things like investor courts, when it comes to things like public services, clearly this is not something you can do behind closed doors. These are biggest aspects of public policy, and you can't override our democratic rights in that way. And again, the fact they keep doing it actually helps us. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, if they released every page of a trade agreement, most people wouldn't be able to understand it. I wouldn't be able to understand it, to be honest. Like, there are only a few experts in the world who understand what this stuff means. By keeping it secret, they're clearly fueling suspicion and speculation about what they're agreeing. Like, why can't you do this in public? Why is it so secret? And actually that helps us. And it so clearly shouldn't be the case if it's touching on all these parts of society, that these things are done in secret. You need to have democratic space to discuss this. Now, I'm critical of the way the EU does it, but it's a damn sight more democratic than we have here at the moment. The EU is probably one of the pioneers at the moment globally for working out how you can make trade policy more democratic. And as I say, that was largely because of the complete catastrophe of TTIP. And they said, well, okay, we're never going to be able to get a trade deal through again if we don't open up this process and make it more democratic. So I think that's what we've got to do with our government here as well, to say we will not let you pass one of these trade deals until you give us some power over what goes in it and what you're negotiating in our name.
Thanks so much, Nick. And you just answered two of the next, I hope you answered two of the next questions I was about to ask. I think you did. But yeah, we had a couple of people just asking sort of like, yeah, whether, like, to what extent this issue of trade is an issue of constitutional justice, and how our current democratic systems like are broken, and how we can yeah, ensure that there's no longer an unaccountable nature of the UK like constitution across the board. But I think you've covered it, but you can jump in and add some extra if you like, but I'll also just jump in with a couple of other questions that we have. One sort of like, what about like in the current, well, there's one question, what about trade post-pandemic? So what does it look like? What can we build post-pandemic? And also in very like direct relation to the US trade deal, Chris has asked if the US trade deal does go ahead, and it does include ISDSs, as you mentioned, and ratchet clauses and so on, what should the long-term strategy be for overturning these? So sort of some kind of immediate and I guess long-term next steps.
Great. So, yeah, trade democracy is something we're still hammering away at that. It's going to be very hard with Johnson's majority to get anything through, but we'll see. I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I think even Tory MPs are going to be actually quite shocked when they realise how little power they have when these deals finally get done. I mean, I just don't think they get it at all. They don't really believe us. And Unlock Democracy, which I'm sure some of you will know, has been working on this aspect as well. So they're good to stay in touch with. So I think the pandemic really throws some of these issues into really stark relief. So, the idea of endless supply chains where it's really, really hard to work out where stuff's even coming from and the conditions it's made under, clearly the pandemic has shown there are some problems with this system. I think it's also going to show problems of intellectual property, because if treatments and vaccines are patented and are priced out of the ability of most people to afford it, huge problem. And I also think food systems, right? I mean, trade rules have fostered much more concentrated industrial scale agricultural systems around the world. And we know that our destruction of the environment and certain ecologies and bringing us closer to animal habitats is one of the things that's promoted this pandemic, as far as we know at the moment. Certainly seems reasonable that may happen in the future as well. So I think there are lots and lots of questions. At the same time, I'm definitely worried at the moment that if you start imposing export restrictions on stuff, that's going to make the pandemic much worse for certain countries. So to say, and you've seen Trump do it, right? I mean, the Germans have accused Trump of piracy, where he's just basically gone in. And there was, a plane full of PPE destined for Germany, and Trump's gone in and just bought it. He's upped the offer. So Trump's kind of nationalist agenda on some of this is really scary, and it's other countries are doing it too. I mean, to be honest, European countries have done it a bit too. So there are big, how do you square this kind of circle that you want to keep markets kind of open at a time like this, but you also need to radically reform the global trade system, because long term it's driving us to complete catastrophe. And this certainly won't be the last or the worst pandemic. And I think it's, for me, it's a really, I hesitate to say there's anything good about the current situation, obviously, but it is a wake-up call of the kind of global economy that we've got. And I think it is an opportunity for us to start building arguments that endless trade liberalization is not good for us. It's caused massive discontent around the world. And to some people who are still kind of in the center of politics, who are like, yeah, we hate all this Trump stuff, let's get back to business as usual, as it, you know, the status quo ante, if you like, things as they used to be. And we need to rally around the WTO. I think it's a really good time for us to say to them that that's not working, and it's not going to work, because it's precisely those rules that got us to this place in the first place. And if you want to keep open markets, if you want a form of international cooperation, which I definitely do, then we need to really rethink these rules. And after the Second World War, this was the thinking that went on. So, you know, part of the international system, the international economy after the Second World War, by no means perfect, but it took account of this kind of stuff. And it said, actually, we need to allow space for regulation and control and all the rest of it. And we need to say it's not the be all and end all at the end of the day, and some things are more important. And I think we need to really hammer that home. And the thing we need to be really careful about, and you're starting to see this coming out now, is the idea, well, what the pandemic shows us is we need more liberalization. And they're doing it with the climate crisis too. So one response to the climate crisis, we need more free trade, because more free trade will allow us to get renewable goods, goods made with less fossil fuels all around the world much more quickly. Well, there are huge problems with that. But one of them is the intellectual property regime as it currently exists doesn't allow that to happen anyway, right? I mean, actually, we do need to be helping other countries by technology transfer, right? But you can't do that under the current trade rules. So I think it is a good opportunity to say, look at some of the most obvious problems, iniquities, and dysfunctions in the global trade system, and let's really point them out. And climate change will allow us to do the same thing as well. I mean, we're not all going up to Glasgow, obviously, now in December, but hopefully we will be doing next year. And again, I want to really push this idea that like really point out some of the contradictions in the trade system, and how endless liberalization will not solve these contradictions, but we do want an international system of cooperation. And here are some ideas that we can begin to leverage. And I think some of the more moderates, hopefully, on the left will also begin to say, okay, maybe this is the only way to save any kind of international multilateral system.
Thanks so much, Nick. And I've had millions of questions come in since, but I'm afraid we're running to a close, to the end of the time. But thank you for them all. I was hoping maybe we could just close on a simple question of like how we can all get involved in pushing for that kind of new democratic, like trade justice, that new vision post-COVID.
Definitely. Well, look, first of all, obviously, sign the petition and all that kind of thing, and we'll keep you in touch with what's going on in the world of trade. And I'd actually quite like to bring together an activist gathering with others, including yourselves, if you're interested, where we actually just bring activists together and have a little mini conference on the US trade deal and what we can do about this. And I think from that, I mean, what we found with the TTIP campaign is people go in different directions, and some people are going to be really, really interested in fighting this particular thing here. But some people are actually really interested in that longer conversation you were talking about, how you create a different sort of trade system. And we found, particularly in Scotland, people were very interested in this, I guess because there's, you know, the possibility of independence, and they'll have an independent trade policy, and that could look quite different, and they have no real idea what that might be. So, you know, that was a good spur for people to, and they got really, really into these trade alternative groups. So maybe that's something where we could have, you know, a broader discussion about, because it's not like we've got all the answers to that. I mean, I've got some ideas, but you know, we all need that. This is a discussion we need to be engaged in as a society if this is something we're all going to own. So maybe we could think of having some little circles or something to discuss that and take it forward. And that would allow you also to feed into our policy and what we're talking about, and vice versa, hopefully.
Awesome. Yes, please. I'm speaking on behalf of all, since I've got the floor. That sounds fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. There we go. There's lots of agreement. So yeah, that sounds brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you. Yeah, can I have a round of Zoom applause? I keep doing this, but yeah, it was brilliant. Just so informative and so insightful. So thank you so much for giving us your time. Yeah, we were thrilled to have you accept our invitation. So glad that everyone here could also join us, and thank you all for coming. Before we do say goodbye, we thought we'd just let you know a little bit about what's coming up again, another reminder. So I'm going to throw over to Katrina for this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rosie, and thanks, Nick. That was wonderful. Yeah, I'm just going to run you through the things we've got coming up. So we're going to pop a few links in the chat for you to sign up for things and click on things and all sorts of fun things like that. The first is our next talk, which is on Thursday, which I mentioned earlier, which is Organising to Win with the United Voice of the World, the trade union, and they've got a nice range of speakers lined up for us. It's looking really exciting, and really to talk about, you know, what we've discovered, or what we've already known, what we already knew, but what a lot of people have discovered about where the power really lies. And during this pandemic, the people that we really need, the fundamental workers, are not the landlords and the bankers and whatnot. They are the supermarket workers and the cleaners and everyone who's still going right now. And we need to really bring that power into those people and get better conditions and better rights for everybody. So we're going to hear about that on Thursday. And I think Rosie's, oh, she's already done it. She's put the link in the chat. On Saturday, we have our elections training for members of the Young Green Party. And that is all about, well, winning elections and how we can do that, because it's very, very important to get Greens elected and Greens in positions of power to fight for all these wonderful things that we've been learning about and we've been hearing about over the last few weeks, and we'll continue to over the next few weeks. You can see all of our online events. So we've got lots more coming up, and I'm not going to talk about all of them because we're already just past 9 o'clock. So I'm going to get the link in there. I think it is already in there. Yeah, so you can see all our online events, and you can also find links to the recordings of the events that we've already had. So if you've missed any and you really want to see it, have a look in there as well. They're all on YouTube. We are also, another reminder that if you are able to give us £2 a month, we would really, really appreciate that. And it would let us put on more of these talks and keep going. And then at some point, when we're back to being able to put on real life events, we can do some of them as well and get some exciting speakers and some training events on where we're all in the same room. Could you even imagine? And finally, the last thing we do in all of these events are classic click to tweet, which is the last link on there. So if you click that link, it'll open up Twitter with a little pre-filled tweet about what a great time you've had today and how you can sign up for the next one. You can edit the text if you want to make it sound a bit more like you. But it's a really good way for us to get the word out about these talks that we're doing. You know, you saying it's great is going to convince your followers and your friends way more than us sending out endless emails. So please do that if you've enjoyed it, and encourage your followers to come to the next one. And now I've done all that with all our links. The only thing remains is to say goodbye, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Rosie for hosting, and thank you to Nick for sharing his wisdom with us.
Yeah.
Thank you
so much. Thanks everybody. Yeah, it's been terrific, and we'll see you next time as we continue to build power from our living rooms and our bedrooms. Yeah, because that's what this is all about. But once again, a huge thanks, Nick, for bringing all of your wisdom to us. It's been so brilliant. So cheers, and see you all in a couple of days. Thanks so much. Cheers. Bye all.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks. Keep the waving going, and probably press stop on the recording.
Oh, good spot.